Hello and welcome to Esther Part 3. This is going to be the thrilling conclusion of the story of Esther. Just to catch you up on where we are last week, Esther's uncle Mordecai asked her to use her position as the queen to try to influence the king into redacting the edict to have all the Jews in the Persian Empire killed. And she was scared because even the queen can't approach the king unless he summons her, and she even told her uncle Mordecai, he hasn't summoned me in a month, so I don't know what you think I'm going to do. But he responds and says, maybe it's just for such a time as this that God has put you in this position. And then Esther got an idea for a way to maybe influence the king, and that's where we're going to pick up this time. Esther's plan was a royal banquet, but she still had to approach the king, which could cost her her life. So she did what any beautiful woman would do. She dressed herself in the most spectacular clothes that she had, and she marched right into the king's throne room. Now this was very dangerous because even the queen couldn't approach the king like that. In fact, the law of the land was only those who the king extends his golden scepter to will live. But Esther was very beautiful, and she had God on her side. And when she walked into the king's throne room, it says that he was immediately taken with her. And he immediately stood up and he extended his golden scepter to her. And it says that she reached out and she put her hand on it. And she said, "O king, if ever I have found favor in you, please grant me this one request." And he said, "I will grant you any request. Whatever it is, even up to a half of my kingdom, you just ask and I'll make it happen." And she said, "I've prepared a banquet, and I would like for you to come. And I would like for you to summon your number 2, Haman. I would like for him to be there as well, because I would like to honor you." So he agrees, and he immediately sends for Haman. And Haman accepts the invitation because what choice does he have? But Haman's an opportunist. Any opportunity to be in front of the king, Haman sees as an opportunity to improve his station. So he jumps at the chance to go and have a banquet with the king and his queen. And while they're at the banquet, King Xerxes knows that Esther's still up to something. So he asks her, "What is your request? What is all this for? I know that you didn't have me come here just to enjoy my company." So while they were in the middle of drinking wine at this banquet for 3, Esther asked him, "If I have ever found favor in your eyes, O king, then allow me to have a banquet tomorrow with you in attendance and Haman in attendance and many others, and then I will share with you my request." And the king, being completely taken with Esther, once again agrees. I mean, no man is going to say no to 2 meals with a beautiful woman. And King Xerxes was no dummy. So he readily agreed, and he told Haman in no uncertain terms, "We will both be there tomorrow." And again, Haman saw this as another opportunity to advance his career. So he went and he left the palace, and he was feeling about 10 feet tall when he walked out. But as soon as he got out of the king's court, he was met with a sight that turned his stomach. Because there at the king's gate was Mordecai the Jew, the man whose insolence had started all of this. Because Mordecai had the audacity to not bow down and worship Haman when he passed by. And now as Haman is leaving the palace, there again is Mordecai, a man that he's made his mortal enemy. And seeing Mordecai drove him into a rage because Mordecai had no response. He didn't stand up at attention and show the respect that Haman thought he deserved. But he also didn't bow down and tremble in fear because Haman had issued this decree to have all of the Jews in the entire Persian kingdom put to death. And in fact, he was going to make an example out of Mordecai. He was going to hang him from a 75-foot gallows so that everyone could see this horrible Jew that brought this on. But Mordecai remained defiant, and it made Haman even more angry. So he went back to his house, and he summoned several of his cohorts and his wife. And at first, he puffed his chest out a little bit, and he told them, "Today, I met with the king and his queen. And they think so highly of me that they didn't even invite anybody else. I'm moving up the corporate ladder so quickly that I'm spending time in the king's private quarters." Oh, but that Mordecai, he's still there. Oh, Mordecai. And one of his cohorts comes up with an idea and says, "Why don't you, instead of building that 75-foot gallows and waiting a whole year to have this guy put to death, why don't you build a 50-foot gallows right in front of the palace and ask the king tomorrow if you can hang Mordecai tomorrow?" Mordecai is doomed. Or is he? That night, as King Xerxes went to bed, he had a fitful night's sleep. He couldn't find any peace or any rest. He tossed and turned for a while, and then he sent for some of his attendants, and he asked them to come and read the royal annals. What better way to put yourself to sleep than to have your attendants read the meeting notes of all of the palace business? But as they were reading the royal annals, King Xerxes was reminded of something. Just a few months ago, there had been a plot to assassinate the king that was being put into motion by a couple of his closest attendants. But there was a man that had stopped that. There's a man named Mordecai the Jew that had sent word to the king of the plot to have him assassinated. And the whole plot was foiled, and the king's life was saved. All because of this man, Mordecai the Jew. So the king spent the rest of the night and the early morning trying to figure out how he might honor this man that had saved his life. While he was still trying to figure out what he might do to honor this man that had saved his life, Haman just happened to come strolling through the front gate. And the king asked his attendant, "Who's in the court?" And he said, "Well, it's Haman." He said, send Haman in. He'll know better than anybody how I can honor someone that deserves honor, like Mordecai the Jew. So the attendant goes out and he summons Haman into the king's private quarters. Now again, Haman, in his bravado, thinks that this is because he's about to be honored. So he comes into the king's quarters, and King Xerxes says, how is it that a man should be honored if a king would like to honor him? Now Haman naturally thinks that the king is referring to him. He thinks he's the one that's about to receive this high honor. So he comes up with the best things that he can think of. He says, "O king, if you were to honor someone, the best way that you could do that would be to clothe that man in a robe that's been worn by the king. And then put the man on a horse that's been ridden by the king. And then take the attendant of the highest honor and have him lead the man on the horse in a parade through the public square so that the entire city can celebrate this man that's receiving honor from you." And as he said that, Xerxes sat back and smiled. He could envision this whole thing in his mind, and he said, "That's a great idea, Haman. Now you go get Mordecai the Jew, and you do exactly that. I want you to take my royal robe and put it on his back. And I want you to put him on my royal horse. And I want you to lead him through the public square so that everyone can honor him in the way that he deserves. And then when he gets back, I want you to put a crown on his head." So Haman does exactly as the king orders. And you can imagine the feeling in his stomach as he's having to take his mortal enemy and give him all of these royal accolades and honors that he thinks he deserves. So after the robing and the parade and the crowning, Mordecai is taken back to the palace gate, and Haman's dismissed to go back home. And when he gets home, all of his friends and co-conspirators and his wife are waiting to hear about the day that he's had. They expect that it's going to be very similar to the day before, where he's been elevated even more in honor and prestige in the kingdom. But he brings them his awful news. But not only did he not receive what he thought he was going to, but he had to give it to Mordecai the Jew. When he tells them the news, Haman's wife, Zeresh, says, "If this Haman, who has begun your downfall, is of the Jews, then you're already dead." The next day, they go to Esther's banquet. Once again, while they're eating and drinking wine, King Xerxes asks Esther, "What is your request? Tell me whatever it is that you want, and I will make it happen, even up to a half of my kingdom." And she kind of shuffles. She looks at her feet, and then she looks back up at the king and says, "King, if ever I found favor in your eyes, the only thing I ask is for my life, and for the life of my family, and for the life of my people. because a plot has been put into motion to have my entire people eradicated from the face of the earth. Xerxes was enraged, and he jumped up and he said, Who's done this? When have they done it? And Esther slowly turned her head and made eye contact with Haman and said, Haman the Agagite has ordered the destruction of all the Jews. Haman's heart sunk. The king was furious. He was so furious that he couldn't even speak. He stormed out of the room and went out to his garden, and he just paced around in the garden, fuming. But Esther remained. And she went and sat down, unsure of what was going to happen. This was a pretty big bomb that she had just dropped on the king. Up until this point, no one had any idea that she was a Jew. No one had any idea that she had any kind of relationship with Mordecai, let alone that he was her uncle who raised her like a father. But as she sat there contemplating, Haman was on his hands and knees begging and pleading for his life. And it was in that position that Xerxes found him when he walked back in. And he says, "What is this? You even attack my wife in my presence, in my house?" And at just that very moment, the king's most trusted advisor said, Haman had a 50-foot gallows built for Mordecai yesterday. I have an idea of what we can use it for right now. And with that, the king snapped his fingers, and a black bag was put over Haman's head, and he was dragged kicking and screaming out of the palace. And he was hung right then and there. It was only after Haman was dead that Xerxes' anger was finally abated. And in his wrath, he gave the entire household of Haman over to Esther. But there was still one little problem that needed addressed. The edict to kill all the Jews was still in effect. Well, the next day, Esther came into the king's presence again and threw herself at his feet and began to weep bitterly. The king was a little unsure of why she was behaving this way, especially after he'd already taken care of Haman for her. And then she reminded him, the edict to kill my people is still in effect. So right there on the spot, King Xerxes sent out word to every corner of the kingdom that not only is the edict to kill the Jews reversed, but even more than that, all of these conspirators who had been enemies of the Jews were now going to be given over into the hands of the Jews. So all of these people who had conspired to kill the Jews would now be left to the Jews' mercy. So in a way, the edict remained. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, all of the enemies of the Jews would be handed over to them. And that's exactly what happened. By this point, Mordecai had been elevated to the number 2 position in the kingdom. So all of these co-conspirators, all of these people who wanted to have the Jews erased, were now the ones living in fear. Now they were the ones that had approximately a year to dread their deaths. And when the day came, all of the conspirators, at least in the town of Susa, where Mordecai and Esther lived, were gathered into one spot, and 500 of them were killed. Xerxes reported this news to Esther and asked if there was still more that should be done. And she asked if they could have one more day. One more day to make sure that all of the enemies of the Jews were dealt with. So the king granted, and he was happy to do so. And in the town of Susa, the next day, 300 more enemies of the Jews were killed. All told, the Bible says, over the entire expanse of the Persian kingdom, 75,000 people were killed. And then on the third day, the Jews feasted and rejoiced. Their enemies had been defeated. And Mordecai sent word to the Jews all over the kingdom that this 14th and 15th day of Adar should be remembered from year to year. They should remember the struggle and the danger that they were in. They should lament and pray. But then on the 15th, they would feast and celebrate and rejoice. And he named the celebration after the lots that Haman had cast to determine the day that the Jews would be killed. The lots were called Pur. And now the holiday that the Jews celebrate even to this day is known as Purim. And that is the end of the story of Esther. Interestingly, the Feast of Purim is something that is still celebrated today. In fact, it was just a couple of weeks ago, as of the recording of this video, it was March 10th of 2020. And I had the opportunity to see a little bit of that in the local synagogue. And it's really cool to watch how they still celebrate how God made their people victorious so many hundreds of years ago. Next week, we will be moving on to a different story. It will probably still be an Old Testament story, but for those of you that watch this and follow this, I do plan on doing this at least through the summer. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.